I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff, and this time I'm still your regular co-host. I'm your archive.org librarian for the week. That's what I am.
That's pretty good. In case you... Oh, hi, I'm Matt Bernico. I'm on the show, too. Dean is always on archive.org, finding the most esoteric Christian leftist content just for you. And I think... Can everyone stand up right now and give him a round of applause? Just go ahead. Wherever you are, just go ahead and give him a...
Yeah, you don't have to do that. Don't no. And then I'm like it's like in a talk show, I'm saying more and more, but then I'm holding my hands out and saying no, stop, but then more and then stop.
That's right. Yeah, just like on a talk show. This is what you're doing.
So just imagine that. Imagine me, you've never seen and have only heard doing that on a talk show.
Oh man, sounds good. The roots are gonna play off until you sit down.
Yeah. I'll leave all my archive.org PDFs with Jimmy on the way out.
There you go. All right. Well, this week we're getting into some interesting. We're getting into some of that archive.org content. Really, if I'm being honest, we're going to talk a little bit about this book called "The Liberation of Theology" by Juan Segundo. And let me introduce it to you a little something like this. Okay. So Dean. You're going to take the place of the imaginary listener that I was going to dream up here. But you've heard of Christian rock. You've heard of Christian movies. But Christian politics?
Whoa.
Isn't it weird that Christians always just put the qualifier Christian in front of things and then they make it their own? And it's, it's not formally different in any way, right? Christian rock is still just rock and roll. But Christians are always trying to stress the Christian contribution that they're making to a genre, to the world, to movies, to politics, etc. And in this episode, what we're going to do is take a look at a book that suggests maybe specific Christian contributions to things are actually just sort of bullshit. In this episode, we're going to take a look at a book called The Liberation of Theology by Juan Segundo. It's a really cool book. I have read some of, and Dean has read all of. That's our level of preparedness. We're going to specifically focus on a section called The Problem of a Specifically Christian Contribution. Segundo's writing gets to the bottom of a kind of interesting impulse within Christianity that tries to articulate its particularity and like its specific contribution to a thing. I mean, in this case, we're talking about politics. We're not going to talk about Christian music. I mean, we could if you want. If you want,
we'll see where the night takes us.
That's right. Yeah, the example that Segundo keeps drawing from is the Christian Democratic Party in Chile. But I mean, I think there are all kinds of different ways this problem kind of presents itself throughout Christian politics in the United States and elsewhere. Like, should you join a political party? Should you join a political group, or should you join a specifically Christian political group? Should you join a union, or should you join a specifically Christian union? I guess those are questions that people wrestle with. I mean, if they're not explicitly, I think they come up in some kind of interesting ways nonetheless.
Yeah.
We're going to get into this question. What's the deal with specifically Christian contributions to politics. That's what we're gonna get into. Dean, what else can we say about Juan Segundo before we get into it?
Yeah, man, there's so much. Juan Segundo, he's a Jesuit. He he's one of the cool Jesuits. So if someone's ever like complaining about the Jesuits to you, you can be like, yeah, but have you ever heard of Juan Segundo? Because he's a great socialist Jesuit. He this book is really interesting. It's like it's kind of like it's not exactly a transcript of lectures, but it's like material that he used to teach a class in the United States. So that's very interesting and kind of lends it like a certain flavor, if you will. It's also a really neat book because it does a lot of weird stuff with like theology as a method, trying to ask some of those questions, but it uses that as a way to talk about all kinds of other stuff like socialism and problems of political violence and all that kind of thing. And he also talks quite a bit about James Cone in it, which is really neat because you don't always get to see like Latin American liberation theologians talking about Black American liberation theologians. So there's a lot going on in the book. So you should read the rest of it. We're not going to talk about all of it here. But what I think I like most about Segundo in this book in particular is that he has this knack for like just not he has a knack for seeing through ways that Christians tell ourselves stories that get us like off the hook for dealing with real problems. And he's like, no, you have to deal with the whole problem, or just like, you're not really dealing with it. And I appreciate that. It's hard to find people who say that in a way that's like really clear and not like annoying to read, because they're just like grinding an axe the whole time. So we'll discuss a little bit more about that in a minute, I think. But before we do, Matt, before we talk about this book that I did find in archive.org, it's probably worth maybe explaining why it's relevant to the particular moment that we're in, and why it's also relevant to Christians now, even though it was published a bunch of years ago. So you mentioned a few kind of weird things earlier, right? The way that Christianity becomes a qualifier for things like politics. But do you feel like I don't know, like when Christians in the United States think about politics, they think about it in very weird ways, it seems to me. And
They do. I agree. Yes.
Yeah. Are there any sort of like movements or habits that sort of come to mind as you've been reading this book?
So many. I mean, I guess we can probably cite a few that we've talked about in past episodes that I think are, specific expressions of this, like Ammon Hennessy's one man revolution. That's a weird
Mm-hmm.
way for a Christian to deal with politics, because it all comes down to just sort of like, you got to just win everyone over by converting them kind of in weird ways by being weird friends with them. Or like, or you brought up the American Solidarity Party a few weeks back. That's a weird way that
Mm-hmm.
Christians have kind of formulated their own specific. I mean, Catholics specifically formulated their own specific like political party. And then like, I mean, I think that this article speaks really directly to the weirdness of post-liberal theology, or like the Stanley Hauerwas types of theology, where Christians are supposed to be they're resident aliens. You're in the world, but not of it.
Mm-hmm.
You're your own weird community doing your thing, not right, not left, but Christian. And I think all of those are sort of expressions of these this weird impulse within Christianity to, I don't know, try to do something that's not politics, but still doing politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I feel too like it sort of speaks into Christian reticence to get involved in politics, and that
Right.
goes with some of
Yeah.
the stuff like you're mentioning with this post-liberal stuff, where people just feel like it's, I don't know, you don't want to get too dirty in the world. You want to keep yourself pure, or make sure that you're staying faithful to the one story that you know is true and not getting caught up in all these other stories. That's one way that I've heard it talked about. But Segundo is like, no, you got to get in there. You got to get dirty with everything else, and you don't have to do it in a specific way. But nevertheless, if you're a Christian, are there any kind of like particular things involved in that too, right? And that's what I love about Segundo is he's like, all right, yeah, what if you are a Christian and you want to be a socialist? He wants to figure out how to sort of bring those two things together without landing you in creating the next Christian rock band of politics.
Yeah, it's important because we that's the last thing anyone needs. No Christian rock bands and politics, please.
It reminds me. It's actually a perfect analogy that you've drawn. I really appreciate it because it reminds me of that episode of King of the Hill where Bobby ends up in that like extremely cool youth group setting, and he goes to that concert, and Hank has a classic line where he talks to the youth pastor, and he says, "Can't you see that you're not making rock and roll better? You're just making Christianity worse." And I feel exactly that way about how a lot of Christians think about politics.
Yeah, I think you're right.
All right, so let's get into it. Segundo talks about the problem of a specifically Christian contribution to politics, and I think he brings it out in some pretty helpful ways. We'll start maybe with his conclusion, which I think is a really nice leading question, and then sort of back up and figure out how he gets to that thought. So he says this in the book: "There is no such thing as Christian theology or a Christian interpretation of the gospel message in the absence of a prior political commitment. Only the latter makes the former possible at all. The unanswered question still before us on the practical level is this: does that mean that we must hold back, hoping that some political option will be possible and that it will be a favorable one before we can begin to understand and appreciate and make use of the gospel message?" And as you can probably guess, the answer is no. We don't have to hold back and wait around. But it's a really interesting question and an interesting problem to pose, right? To sort of make that clear that there's no Christianity outside of a political commitment already is really significant. It leads to questions not only about whether or not you would join a socialist party or something, but also raises questions about whether or not you've already assented to certain political options or opinions without maybe making those clear. And I think by doing that, Segundo just puts us on like a different terrain to start asking some important questions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it, that you might have already agreed to certain types of political ideas without you even really knowing it, right? I mean, like that's just that's the case because of your material conditions. You're living in a capitalist country, and for a time, I mean, unless you're now a super woke socialist or something, there's a time when
Mm-hmm.
you were at least assenting, you're in agreement with capitalism just by like like osmosis. It's in the air. You're sucking it all up, and you can't help but be a capitalist or something.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's helpful just to that he lays it out so explicitly, though, right? Like, there's no Christian theology before you have that. I think that's a really helpful thing that you're if you can be cognizant of that, you
Mm-hmm.
can already win half the battle.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. It's also just helpful as a way of cutting through those ways that Christians hide behind Christianity in order to pretend
Yeah.
that they don't have to get involved with politics, right? Because it's like, well, there's nothing to hide behind because you're already in the middle of it. So you have to make a decision about whether or not you're going to stay on track or find a different one.
Well, it also cuts around all of the bullshit of like a biblical politics or something, right? Like,
Right,
what's
right.
the biblical answer to this? And it's like, well, that's not a helpful, it's not a helpful question if you've already assented to some type of political ideology before you even get to
Mm-hmm.
the Bible. So
Mm-hmm.
it's good. It just cuts against all of the worst evangelical stuff that I hate.
All right. Well, we should get some of Segundo's themes on the table here so we can drive through some of these problems, figure out what kind of things we're assenting to and how we might do it differently. Segundo relies on a Brazilian theologian quite a bit named Hugo Asman, and he introduces him saying this. In one of his articles, Hugo Asman acknowledges that the use of Christian labels for leftist political movements can have temporary and tactical value insofar as it undermines the use of Christianity by the political right. Aside from this temporary tactical use, however, Asman thinks it is evident that the normal involvement of the Christian with the political left should not be viewed as an involvement between Christian revolutionaries on the one hand and other revolutionaries on the other hand. There is no Christian ally with a distinctive nature and contribution of their own who can be isolated from other revolutionaries in this way. That's what I love about Segundo. Just laying it all out right on the table. There can't be any Christian ally, distinctively Christian, a Christian revolutionary in difference to all these other revolutionaries. Kind of a wild thing to say, but it's true.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you can see immediately how this would rub a whole lot of people the wrong way, right? People that
Right.
think that their Christianity is always first before their politics, that their political view has no sort of bearing on their Christianity or something. This is going to
Mm-hmm.
immediately mess them up, right? You know,
Hmm.
you can't say that you're just a Christian kind of living in the world doing your Christian thing without any kind of political thought attached to it. That's not something that you can actually do. And in
Hmm.
fact, like you shouldn't, because it'll end. I mean, we'll see in a minute why it's a problem, but just get rid of the qualifier and just get into it.
Yeah, I think it's helpful too because all right, say you've passed through the evangelical problems of thinking you're outside of politics, and then you've also passed through the post-liberal problems of being like, I'm in the true politics of the church. You've
Hmm.
passed by both of those traps, and you found yourself in a real socialist kind of situation. I think that a lot of people who get there do still kind of wrestle with this, where they're like, yeah, I'm a socialist, but I'm here as a Christian socialist specifically,
Right.
and they sort of remain hung up on seeing politics as maybe like an extension of having an authentic spiritual life, or being an expression of one's particular Christian persuasion.
Hmm.
I don't think that people should like not integrate their spiritual and political lives at all. You know, like I'm definitely a communist because I'm a Christian. That part's true. But like, I don't show up in communist spaces and I'm like, I'm here as a Christian revolutionary, or like,
Yeah.
I'm here as a Christian ally to the communists.
No, that I think that makes sense though, right? Like, uh, it's you can integrate your spirituality into your faith in the sense that it's motivating for you, it's existentially meaningful, it's spiritually meaningful. All these things are good, and like like embrace that. But they're not making a material difference. Like you're there anyways, right? Like
Hmm.
your butt
Hmm.
is in the seat. So like that's the important part, not the motivation. I mean, at least I mean on externally and to all your comrades in the room, they definitely don't care that you're here because of church or something. They care that
Yeah.
you're here because you're here, and like announcing that you're here because you're a Christian or something is not super important.
Yeah, I mean, it's to sort of go to the old materialist point. You know, the boss doesn't care if you go to church on Sunday or not if you don't show up for work on a strike. So
Right.
it's not to say that going to church on a Sunday does or doesn't matter, but it just means that for the purposes of actually thinking about how capitalism works, like you said, your butt's in the seat or it's not,
Yeah.
and that's where the rubber hits the road.
I do appreciate the provision of temporary or tactical value. That's
Yeah,
when it
yeah,
matters to be a Christian. I like that a lot. That's very fun.
yeah,
I was thinking
yeah.
about this the other day, and I have an acquaintance who is a pastor, and she's also like involved in like labor organizing in my city, and
Hmm.
just trying to kind of get to the bottom of like it's interesting that she's like involved for like all the reasons that I'm interested in labor too, right? She's a Christian. That's kind of like what motivates her. But I was also kind of thinking like what kind of things does that afford the organization that she's a part of? That she's a pastor, right? And that she's
Hmm.
also a part of this organization. Like what kind of like moral weight does that give this organization, and like how does that work sort of in this like in the tactical sense? And I think that's a really cool idea that I don't know, Christians should embrace more often. I mean, plenty
Yeah.
of them do for sure. Like I don't want to like take away from that, but like um but being a Christian and being visible in like in the labor movement or in some other activist community does have a tactical value to it that I think
Hmm.
is good. It's cool.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about this with respect to different Christian liberation movements around the world, right? Like, you could think of the Christians for National Liberation in the
Hmm.
Philippines. They're such an interesting group because they are a specifically Christian group, but they're housed within the National Democratic Front, which is led by the communists. And I think it's like it's an interesting example of how these things kind of go together in important ways, right? It is definitely a tactical kind of thing, which is not to say that people aren't authentically Christian in
Right,
that
right.
particular movement, but like they understand that there's a sort of political use to naming that. And at the same time, in Christians for National Liberation, they don't sort of represent like one interest group or like a sort of special identity constituency within the communist movement. They see themselves as like fully integrated.
Hmm.
And this is like one part of their life that's very important, and I think that is like instructive. You could probably do the same with like the Three Self movement in China, or maybe even like the Christians for Socialism in Chile or something, which is very important to Segundo. So anyway, all that to say, there's a lot of precedent for this kind of thing, but it doesn't look like I don't know, creating like the super Christian political party or something.
Yeah, totally. It's cool. It's a good note though. The danger is that it comes off as too tactical, like opportunist or something. But
Hmm.
but like with Christians for National Liberation and some of the other groups that you mentioned too, like they I don't know. I think that they're there to kind of demonstrate a moral weight to the movement, and I
Hmm.
think that
Hmm.
it works.
Yeah, I think that's right.
All right, well, let's read something else from Segundo. Um, that's what we do. All right, so this is more of Segundo on Osman. Of course, Osman could not rest content with that assertion, the assertion that there can't be Christian allies and you should just kind of fall in line. For if it is true that Christians have no distinctive contribution of their own to make to liberation, why be a Christian at all? So Osman starts over again and tries to explain himself more clearly. This is a quote from Osman then. That does not at all deprive the expression Christian contribution of valid content. It simply moves us beyond the traditional way of posing the problem, which entailed picturing the Christian contribution as some alienating and restraining contribution of specific sort, as some sort of doctrinal a priori set above and over against the revolutionary facts and deeds. All right, so I think that this is kind of when we get into I mean, Osman and Segundo are both kind of like talking about these more like they have these more conservative movements in mind, but I think that this kind of idea, at least when I read it the first time, kind of speaks to the impulse within post-liberal Christianity and post-liberal like theology. The again the Stanley Hauerwas sort of vibe. Um, like I get this is my like self-understanding of these things, and if I'm wrong then you can tell me on Twitter or whatever. But the what the like the Christian contribution seems to be very important for those like I don't know, theological genres or whatever. Peculiar thing about Christianity, and the particular thing about Christianity ends up being really important for those types of theology. Like Stanley Hauerwas and Will Willman wrote a book called Resident Aliens that's all about that Christians have to be this community set apart, and like to kind of do politics and justice and have a kind of culture of their own. And I mean I see a lot of that as embracing like that specific Christian contribution. And in light of Segundo, that seems very hollow and pretty empty,
Hmm.
right? Like, what are you really
Hmm.
fighting for in those moments? If there is no Christianity before politics, then like that whole setup, I think, kind of loses its really what drives its importance. But all that being said, it doesn't necessarily like completely get rid of the importance of the Christian contribution, or it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be a Christian at all. So I don't know, Dean, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the most important thing to sort out, and also the toughest one of what does a Christian contribution actually mean if it doesn't mean setting up like a special interest group or like a party within a party or something.
Hmm.
And I mean, probably there are lots of answers to this question, but at least for me, I think it means something like if Christianity is supposed to like make you a good comrade, as we always say, then it should do exactly that. Like the Christian contribution is to be a good comrade shaped by the best parts of Christianity, I hope. The kinds of things that would make you a humble person or able to kind of look soberly at the world around you and also have this kind of keen sense of like the marginalized that show up in every single society, whether they're capitalist or socialist. Those are Christian contributions that I think are pretty important. But that's a very, very different thing than presuming the Christian contribution is, this like a priori set of doctrines that you have to sort of show up to every protest with like a checklist to find out if like they meet the standards of Catholic social teaching or
Right.
some kind of secret Christian test. I mean, I see this a lot on like Twitter, right? Like a lot of Christians who are into the left in what capacity I don't necessarily know. They sometimes seem to exhibit some kind of anxiety about like I'm a socialist, but like don't get it twisted, like
Hmm.
most importantly I'm a Christian.
Right.
And like that's definitely fine as a sort of personal idea for sure, but to make Christianity the sort of all consumptive identity that like I don't know, is constantly getting in the way of you sort of contributing to a socialist movement or not. I think that is not necessarily a contribution of Christianity in itself. It's more a contribution of a certain kind of anxiety or something, which is something to be a little more wary of.
One of the phrases that Segundo uses and Osman uses that kind of sticks out to me, though, is like being a Christian ally, that there's no such thing as a Christian ally. And I think that's a really helpful articulation of it, too, because, I mean, kind of speaking of that, I don't know, the masses on Twitter, right? The Christian leftists on Twitter. They're ready to throw down with a socialist movement as long as it kind of like meets their qualifications, like they're provisionally there, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I think that provisionally there-ness, I mean, it sucks for a lot of material reasons. It sucks to build a movement with people like that because like they're not really a part of it, right? They're only there for as long as you're serving their sort of ends and means. But I think it's also like profoundly unchristian to do that, right? It's kind of like it's a really selfish type of orientation towards politics, that you're only going to be a part of this as long as it fits your exact sort of specifications. And that sucks because like that's not really, I don't know. There's a certain type of like openness to Christianity of coming alongside people and like being present there even if it's not exactly your thing. Um and I don't know. Yeah, I guess I'm convicted about this Christian allyship. Don't be an ally. Just like be in or be not in, and I think that's it. Don't be lukewarm. I mean, that's the whole thing, right? Lukewarm Christians, they get spit right out of God's mouth in Revelation.
That's right.
And that's
You're
not where
just
you want to
being
be.
a good biblical Christian.
You don't want to be the gazpacho of the end times.
No, nobody does. Speaking of that gazpacho, Segundo talks a lot about the Christian Democrats in Chile as a sort of case study to illustrate his point. And I won't go into all the details of it, but I do think it's actually a pretty instructive example that is obviously extremely specific to a particular moment in time, but has some lessons beyond that. So Segundo's talking about the lead up to Salvador Allende being elected president of Chile. If you don't know about Allende, you should definitely Google him. He's very, very cool, an interesting guy. Anyway, in the lead up to Allende getting elected, there was a sort of big question about what the Christian Democrats would do. They were some of the swing voter types, and the party, for a number of reasons, had always sort of listed around, like sometimes moving toward the right, sometimes toward the left or the center. You would think that if your party, which the Christian Democrats are, is premised on a certain like assumption that you're the Christian party representing Christian ideas and principles, that you wouldn't be sort of moving around all the time. But Segundo points out why. So in particular, the Christian Democrats try to present a third way kind of politics, right? Neither left nor right, Christian Democrats. They're supposed to apply Christian teaching in the political arena. But as Segundo says, one of the profound ironies of it is, first of all, that Christian teaching develops over time. So your political program basically has to develop over time,
right?
In ways that maybe give the lie to the whole project. But also, Segundo says, once the Christian Democrats started winning certain electoral battles, they found out that they couldn't just be moralists. They had to like develop real political programs, and that creates a lot of problems. But most significantly, Segundo has this sort of theory that all third way movements end up being right-wing movements or counter-revolutionary movements. And he explains that in this way. He says, mathematically speaking, the third way cast of the Christian Democratic movement became crystal clear during Allende's presidency. It systematically allied itself with the right, forming decisive majorities against the policies of the left. It also became clear that its talk about community ownership or things like a revolution and liberty was only its way of saying it was not with the left, not even when the left was trying to put through those very objectives. Finally, through direct dealings with other groups and indirect acts that paralyzed the country, the Christian Democrats handed over the reins of government to the military junta. It is hard to find in the historical annals of a Christian party a more convincing confirmation of Asman's basic hypothesis, that is, that evangelical conditions imposed on the revolutionary process in a priori terms eventually turn into third-way strands, and that they also turn into counter-revolutionary forces when and if the revolution becomes feasible. It's a very strong claim, obviously, and it's a general claim that Segundo is making, but I think it's one that deserves to have some airtime, or at least be thought through in some pretty important ways.
Mm-hmm. Right. That I mean, it's one that we already know, I think, pretty well in the United States in 2020, that like centralists are going to split the vote from the left. I mean, it's kind of the
Mm-hmm.
vibe, right? Um, that it'll end up serving the right in a few different ways. In
Mm-hmm.
terms of, I mean, in terms of electoralism for sure. But in terms of like public opinion as well. Those like evangelical conditions, like or framing them as evangelical, I think is really interesting too, right? That you're trying to convert people to this like certain like moralistic way of thinking about politics, even when they might have like they would actually have an ally in policy on the left. They're
Mm-hmm.
gonna create these sort of talking points, that end up serving the right because they don't actually ally with the left. They're people who aren't allies. They're people who are trying to make their own thing happen, in spite of the left also trying to do the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's helpful to sort of give the why to that third way approach in general too, because it is so attractive to a lot of people, right? Like even a lot of Christians who are willing to say, yeah, politics is important. They end up promoting that sort of third way thing because they rightly intuit that like the left and right, especially in a place like the United States, are often two sides of the same coin. That's true. But the third way politics ends up being like a third side of the coin. It ends up being it's the little ridges on the quarter
That make it tip towards the right.
Yeah, exactly. And what you really have to do is throw that quarter in the gar. I don't know what you're supposed to do with this metaphor, but
put that quarter in a gumball machine.
Yeah, that's right. Put it in a gumball machine and chew that socialist gum.
You're almost there.
Yeah, I'm almost there. I'm sure a listener at home has already gotten it, so I'm just going to trust that's true. But I think it's, I think of folks like, I don't know, like Jim Wallace, a well-meaning guy. He's done some good stuff, but seems to be, to me, sort of a textbook third wayer, right? He'll definitely endorse the Democrats over the Republicans. Seems like a left-wing guy sometimes, but by and large, not willing to sort of throw in and question sort of the whole apparatus all at once. Or if he does, it's premised on the imaginary position of like the Christian beyond contemporary politics. And I think it's important to sort of resist those temptations because they're a little too neat and tidy.
Right. I mean, we had the episode not too long ago where we talked about the Christian impulse towards the third way, right? Not
Mm-hmm.
left, not right, but Jesus, just Jesus, man. And it's the same exact thing here. The impulse is to not get dirty and not get weighed down in actually doing politics.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the irony of the Christian Democrats in Chile was that they actually had to. It didn't turn out so
Right.
well. But I mean, this impulse is still, I mean, it's rampant in Christianity today, where you want, obviously you can think, you can see all the social ills, right? You can see that capitalism is bad. It's causing poverty, and there's racism, and there's like sexism and homophobia and all these kind of like social ills, right? And you just don't want to have to deal with like policy that would either exacerbate or help either of them. So
Mm-hmm.
instead,
Mm-hmm.
you want to build a community organization where you can rely on your church community and your neighbors, and you want to like start a soup kitchen or something instead, right? And doing so, you end up I mean, like dissuading a lot of people from things that would actually solve those problems. And
Mm-hmm.
you give more gas to the right.
Yeah, that's right. And also, yeah, like you mentioned earlier, it's important to recognize that centrists often will end up siding with the right over and against the excesses of the left or the perceived excesses of the left. And it's always important to sort of figure out where Christians are doing that too, providing comfort for the right by refusing to engage the radical demands of even certain wild lefty Christians.
Right.
So I think it's important to figure that out. The basic point, though, that I think Segundo really drives home is that Christians often start out in sympathy with revolutions, but they impose these kind of Christian conditions on them. So it's important to sort of figure out how Christians can easily end up becoming anti-revolutionaries, maybe in spite of themselves or like because of themselves, however you want to put it. It strikes me that so many kind of Christian lefty types are like one stone's throw away from exactly that move. All right, so that is a lot about maybe trying to sort of avoid making the wrong political choice. But we said earlier we were going to talk about how you might have already assented to certain politics. Segundo is also great at pointing that out, and he does so again talking about the Chilean situation. So he has a long discussion of the Chilean bishops and how they were responding to socialism, and they end up sort of they criticize socialism, the Chilean bishops, and they don't say that like if you're a socialist then you're not a Catholic or something, but they go out of their way to say socialism isn't good. They don't end up saying the same thing necessarily about capitalism, or at least not as stridently. And so Segundo is really interested in that. And his suggestion is that in so doing, in criticizing socialism, they end up actually promoting capitalism. And how he sorts it out, I think, is really instructive. So he says, how is it that the bishops end up opting for the capitalist ideology as opposed to the socialist ideology? The answer is obvious enough. In saying that socialism is not an acceptable alternative to the existing capitalist system, the bishops are not at all aware of the fact that they are choosing between ideologies. Strange as it may seem to us, they think that they are avoiding an ideological option in saying that. So basically they're saying like you shouldn't be a socialist, even though they recognize that like something's got to change. They say Segundo says the mental process at work here is clear enough. In the eyes of the bishops, the existing reality is not an ideology, it's simply reality. They have no doubt that it should be corrected, but as they see it, reality as such does not splinter the faith. So long as no ideologies about this reality arise, faith has nothing to fear from the fact that extremely wealthy human beings live alongside extremely poor human beings. The problem arises when an ideology challenges this reality. The great sin of Christians for socialism, in other words, is that there's no party of Christians for capitalism. Of course, such people exist, but they do not have to join together under a banner to exercise their influence and carry out their program. But any attempt to put through a radical change in the existing structures must present itself as an ideology. It must knock on the door of the Christian heart and appeal to its relationship with the authentic values of the faith. So here's what Segundo is sort of getting at. The bishops in attacking socialism, but not like outright attacking capitalism as such, or at least the bishops not endorsing socialism, ends up being a tacit endorsement of capitalism because that's the world in which we live. Segundo says that the bishops sort of take that for granted and they think that that's just how things are, but Segundo points out that to sort of endorse that is to take a political position. So it returns us to that idea that there's no Christianity outside of politics, and that if you think you're not making a choice, you probably are actually making a choice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's ideology at its base, right? Marx says that ideology is, it's what you're doing when you don't know you're doing it, and that's what you've just described explicitly. So, yeah, I think that's a really powerful idea, though. And man, Christians are so bad at it because especially when it comes to things that even progressive things that seem like Christian values, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
for example, there was a church in my city. Uh, I live in Missouri. Missouri just voted on this thing that would expand Medicaid for the state. That's
Mm-hmm.
it. It's like as far as like radical changes go, this is pretty reformist and it's pretty mild, but it's important nonetheless. Anyways, this
Mm-hmm.
church in my city, they put like a vote yes on Medicaid expansion sign in front of the church, and like that's cool. I don't have any problem with that. That's fine with me.
Mm-hmm.
The church posted like online though about it and was like, listen, this isn't even politics. This is just our Christian value. And like maybe that is the tactical maybe we could understand that as the tactical advantage of being a Christian on the left or something, right? But at the same time, it is kind of annoying because it's doing this exact same thing. That it's trying to say it's trying to remove politics from something that is political.
Mm-hmm.
I would much rather the church just be like, "Yep, this is politics, and this is what we're doing." Like, I'd rather
Right.
it be much more upfront about it. but yeah, I mean, it's trying to kind of take a step back and distance itself from it, but still being political, even though it means not to be.
Yeah, I mean, you see this kind of thing in a lot of Christian circles, people who just sort of don't want to get involved in politics, as we said earlier. But I think it's always important to emphasize that that choice is already getting involved in politics, that there's no sort of position outside of it. And it also cuts against the sort of post-liberal stuff you mentioned earlier, because there's a sense in which, okay, the church is the true politics, the real politics. But as we say a lot on this podcast, if you capitalism doesn't mind if you like hang out at church a lot. It doesn't really mind even if you like drop out of the economy. Like that's fine.
Hmm.
They're not going to make a lot of money off of you anyway. Probably. What capitalism minds is a direct challenge at like the point of production or something like that. And I think that is really key. That if you think that you're dropping out, or you think that you're sort of on a plane outside of it, or that you've retreated to the church as politics, you have basically already sided with the status quo in that sense, because you know that it's not gonna change that worldly situation. So you might feel better in your soul, or you might feel like you're kind of living a bit more of a pure life, but unfortunately you end up kind of in the same position as the bishops. I think that Segundo mentions. You end up supporting capitalism in spite of not wanting to. And I think it's important for Christians to reflect on that, because it stops us from all too easy sort of answers to the political mess.
Yeah, that's really good. Um, well, I mean, I guess that kind of leaves us then um, back at the beginning where we started off the conversation. If you'll recall, and I'm sure you do because we've said it 1,000 times so far in this episode. Um, Segundo ends this chapter saying that there's no such thing as a Christian theology or a Christian interpretation of the gospel in absence of a prior political commitment. So I guess like what this actually means in the end is that if you are a Christian and you're committed to like left wing ideas in some ways, then like okay, good.
Hmm.
But it means that you have to be committed, and I think a pretty concrete way, right? You're not just being a Christian ally, not being a Christian who's interested in socialism, but just like be a socialist. I
Hmm.
feel a little bit stupid saying that because I think it's what we say almost every week, but I'm not uh on a podcast, on every podcast. This is a universal theory podcast. There's a smart person and a funny person. And I think Dean's the smart person and I'm the funny person, and I'm just going to say the same stupid thing over and over again. And it's just be a socialist, and that's it. And that's the same stupid thing.
It's hilarious to me. I'm busting a gut over here, and I love it. I love that. Yeah, I mean, it does sound like being a broken record, for sure. But I think it's important to repeat a lot, especially in an election year, because I think Christians are desperate to figure out what to do in a situation like this. And it's so tempting as a Christian to come up with lots of really weird ways of thinking about how the world works. And, it's not to say that we have it all figured out or anything, but I think Segundo is trying to push Christians into groups or associations of people who are working very hard to figure out how the world works, right? Like that's what socialism is doing. Socialist parties are big apparatuses for trying to sort out like the whole political situation. And they don't always do it correctly or whatever, but like they're giving it a shot. And I think Christians have so many ways of thinking Christianly about how to never get your foot in the door, that you could do a lot worse than like ending up in a sort of flawed communist party or something.
Yeah.
You might as well like take a lesson where you can get it.
Yeah, totally. I think that's good, right? The flawed Communist Party, the other flawed Communist Party, that one's fine too. They're all
But
good.
not the third one. Not the third one. That one's very bad.
The Revolutionary Communist Party, don't go to that one. It's so important that that's not the one you choose.
Wow, really dropping an extremely particular niche sectarian comment in the middle of this episode.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Um, but I think it's in yeah. But I guess all I'm trying to say is it is really important that we that Christians don't just like I don't know, kind of remain spectators and
Hmm.
stay on the sidelines, but like actually joining organizations and organizing with people And I think taking direction from people is really important. I don't know.
Hmm.
Like, you don't want to be. Well, we've said that being a Christian should make you a good comrade, and I think that we need to really think about like what that means. And it doesn't mean like being like a Twitter leftist and then showing up to like a meeting, of whatever, and then trying to
Hmm.
be in charge. It means like shutting up and listening to the people who are already there and already organizing and who've already been in these communities and already been organizing for years, right?
Hmm.
And falling into line, I think, in some meaningful ways, I think is uh, what Christian leftists should do.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, showing up in those spaces and not presuming that you already have the answers because you
Yeah.
have like the right theological program or the right kind of biblical theology, right? Being willing to sort of recognize that uh, truth emerges in those sort of political situations, and you have a lot to learn from them, rather than imposing that evangelical sort of point at the beginning. There's a few moments in this book where Segundo refers to James Cone in particular, saying that like uh you can't really have like a priori universals in the process of liberation, but you discover sort of moments of truth in that process. And I think that is like an important thing for Christians to learn as well, right? That you need to be willing to like learn some stuff you don't know about the world, rather than, yeah, again, just sort of imposing the litmus test at the outset.
That's right. Nobody cares. Nobody cares how big of a Christian pacifist you are and how many Bible verses you know. That's for Bible quizzing at church, not for a strike line.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And listen, Bible quizzing at church is great. Like you should 100% convince everybody in your small group of your extremely niche and particular Christian vision. Not getting down on that at all. We try to do it on this podcast once a week. But I don't talk about it with my comrades all the time. They know I'm the Catholic one, and that's good enough for them. It's good enough for me.
That's pretty good. All right. Well, we'll get into an organization and don't be annoying.
I think that's a very good last word. I will say though, you should all go to archive.org, but if you do, don't check out all the books, because you can only check out one book at a time, sometimes for only an hour, and it is the absolute worst system I've ever heard of for a thing on the internet.
Archive.org
And we need it for this podcast.
we need it for this podcast. Archive.org has created a system of scarcity where it does not need to exist, and it's so frustrating.
So that's going to be the first my specifically Christian contribution to the socialist movement is going to be a total reform of archive.org and absolute abolition of copyright law, so that information can truly flow, and so we finally all have access to all the liberation theology books we've ever wanted.
I'm in. That's a good contribution to make.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you do that, you can hear another podcast that we do once a week. That's right, 2 podcasts a week. We can't believe it either. That one is about current events and some bad jokes that we make, and you can get that for $2 or more a month. You can buy some stickers. Dang, we got a cool new sticker that we should have said at the beginning of this podcast, that we'll say at the beginning of the next one, I guess, by Ryan Cagle, friend of the show, Ryan Cagle. He designed a really extremely awesome heavy metal inspired Virgin Mary sticker for us. You can find that on our Redbubble store. You can find t-shirts there and whatever else. You can find us on Twitter at the Magnificast. You can email us at themagnificast@gmail.com. And as always, our music is by Amoria Armstrong and the Illogical Spoon. See you next week.
Get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Jackson. You keep your hoods up, well, you keep your hoods up.